Okay, hello and welcome. My name's Joel Baglol. I'm the Manager of Communications at DRI Canada, and I'd like to welcome you all to the session entitled The Need for an Integrated Approach to Manage Third-Party Risks. Before I introduce our presenters this morning, I just want to mention that if you have any questions, there will be time at the end of the session for a Q&A. So presenting to you today are Philip Racco and Deepak Jaswal. Each of them are senior managers at MNP and specialize in business continuity, disaster recovery, and crisis management. Mr. Racco is a consultant in MNP's enterprise risk practice, specializing in enterprise risk management and business resilience. He has provided input and support for the development of multiple enterprise risk, crisis management, and business continuity programs. He holds a master's degree in disaster and emergency management from York University in Toronto. Mr. Jaswal is a senior manager in enterprise risk services at MNP. He has experience in enterprise risk and internal audits, having worked closely with organizations in both the public and private sectors to help them manage risks and optimize their operations. He holds a Bachelor of Laws degree from Brunel University, London in the United Kingdom. Please join me in welcoming Philip Racco and Deepak Jaswal.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Just going over that real quick. So myself, Phil Racco, as Joel alluded to, both Deepak and I are senior managers in MNP's Enterprise Risk Services practice. Just by quick way of further introduction, so the way that I kind of got into my consulting career was through business continuity of operations, emergency response, disaster recovery. So that is kind of how I came into things as a fairly young individual straight out of university. And then I've had the opportunity in my career to kind of expand out into other areas of risk. You know, as a consultant, the firms want to keep you busy, so they push your limits and make you think about different things. But I always kind of come at things from that hazard and risk and continuity of operations perspective. That's the way my brain works. That's the way I was kind of trained. And it's kind of interesting to see how it kind of expands into other areas. So just a little bit about myself and my colleague Deepak.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. So as alluded to, I actually am a corporate lawyer. I wrote the bar in the UK, specialised in contract law, and then actually moved over from PwC in London, England to MNP. As alluded to, we kind of help a number of different organisations across public sector, private sector, and multiple different industries in managing their third-party risk management approaches. And looking forward to presenting today.
Awesome. So again, there's that good old existential question, why are we all here? So I'm not going to get into like the philosophical elements of that, but more of just for our conversation for today. So it probably goes without saying for everybody that's in this room is that there is kind of this ever-expanding third-party network that organizations are working with and working towards, right? Outsourcing of different services, different agreements that we might have in place depending upon what it is that we are doing. And as a result of that, there's interesting different risk exposures that come with that, right? That organizations may or may not have an appreciation for. The interesting and most, I think, relevant piece for our conversation for today is that at the end of the day, because of these relationships that we get into, a third party's risks end up becoming your risks, right? And again, as business continuity professionals around this room, we've always kind of thought in this way from thinking about disruption and what, you know, our supply chain, what might happen in one area kind of continues down into others, right? So there's always that interesting aspect to think about when we think about our networks, when we think of, and I don't mean system networks, more of our, you know, operational networks, right? As we work through these things, what exposures are we thinking about? And, you know, we've actually kind of seen this be fairly interesting. There's going to be a couple of examples that we allude to, but a lot of regulated spaces have started to think about this quite a bit. So we're actually seeing a number of regulators, you know, particularly in the financial services space, think about this and start to expand their concepts and what their expectations are of the regulated entities when thinking about this. So in, you know, the work that Deepak and I have been doing, we have been noticing an increased focus in this area. And quite frankly, it kind of is going towards the need for a better approach from our opinions, right? So what we want to talk to everyone about today is what is that potential that lies there? What is that potential that lies there as risk managers more broadly, but specifically when it comes to, you know, a continuity of operations approach or from an avoiding disruption. So what are the overall objectives we want to get to from today? So we want to, at a minimum, help to increase a broader understanding that we have when it comes to where things are going from third-party risk management in general. We also want to make sure that we can give you an understanding, or at least an appreciation from what we've been thinking about when it comes to third-party risk management and the life cycle that we see, and kind of how we've termed it. And then the third thing that we want to do is, and this is kind of our little thesis statement, hopefully leave you with an appreciation for why we view there's a need for a better, more holistic and integrated approach from, you know, continuity of operations professionals specifically, but also from risk managers more broadly, and how can we fit into that overall picture. So those are our three main objectives. There's no test at the end, so I don't know if we're going to hit all those, but hopefully we hit all three of those objectives as we go through things. In order to do that, and we're going to adjust our timelines a little bit, not to, you know, cut anything short, but, you know, to keep things running smoothly. This is essentially what we want to walk through. So we've already completed our introductions, can put a check beside that one. We want to go through a little bit of a definition of what third-party risk is, because it's actually an expanding definition. Hold your breaths, it's quite interesting. Then walk through the third-party risk management and what we deem the life cycle, and then speak about that call for an integrated approach, and then there's some time at the end for questions and wrapping up. The one thing I will say is, I know there's a spot at the end for questions, but I have 3 little boys under 8. I am very used to being interrupted mid-sentence. If there is a burning question that the group has, throw up your hand, yell at us. Deepak has the mic, we'll kind of come over and go through that. But again, there is going to be some time towards the end for questions if it does come down to that. Awesome. So without further ado, we want to get into our first topic, which is defining this concept. What is third-party risk?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I think we just want to take a little bit of time here, because traditionally what we've seen is normally when you think of a third party, people think of a basic vendor just providing goods or services. But third-party risk management is a lot broader than that. And specifically, it really looks at an entity or person that works on behalf of an organization or is being considered for such a role but is not an employee. And this is where it's important to note it includes consultants, contingent workers, clients, business partners, service providers, subcontractors, vendors, suppliers, affiliates, partners, and any other person. A third party may itself have organizations performing work on their behalf. We can either call this a fourth party, and as this chain goes on, we refer to it as an nth party. One of the reasons we want to actually highlight this is, again, we have seen a number of changes even across legislations. Recently, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions actually changed their B10 guideline, which manages third parties, to move away from traditionally what's seen as outsourcing activities to actually the broader management of third parties. Phil and myself actually did have a hand in that as well, so I do apologize for anyone who was impacted with that. But I do think it is very important that we do consider just how broad this concept can be. So really what we've done here, we've kind of looked to highlight a diagram just to outline what the relationships look like with the parties themselves. So the first party, again, is generally the party that's looking to outsource an activity or service to a different entity or obtain support for that level. A second party is usually a party that's related to the first party, often a subsidiary or a parent company. And then we actually get to the third party itself, which is the entity that performs the work on behalf of the third party. What's very important to note here is that it is only the third party that has a contractual obligation to the first party. So generally what we've seen across multiple industries is a lot of organizations are very good at, first of all, hiring a third party and performing elements of due diligence and risk on that third party. What they're not necessarily good at is understanding what risk management practices that third party has in place to actually manage the parties that they hire. And the issue of what this becomes is again, the nth party or fourth party has no obligation to the first party. They are only contracted by the third party. So your recourse of action often is only limited to the third party itself. And so it's very important to get an understanding of what risk management practices does your third party have, and then their third party, and then their third party. And this chain can go deep, and we saw this during COVID, that we went almost 20 deep And then originally we had concentration risks. Car manufacturers couldn't get their parts that they required. And we had a real realization of basically we need a deeper understanding of how far our supply chains go, but what practices and what prudent practices can we actually develop to help get a better understanding here.
So with that piece, and we think about that definition that Deepak was highlighting there about what a third party is, if we go to and then step back, so third party, what is third party risk, right? Essentially, at the end of the day, it's the threats that stem from any of those relationships that Deepak was highlighting there, right? With our partners, with our affiliates, with whoever it is that we may or may not be contracting with through any type of relationship, right? Doesn't necessarily have to go through the delivery of services. It is somebody that is associated with us, hopefully contractually, that their risks then become our own. And again, speaking to a bunch of continuity professionals, right, you can think about the variety of implications that come down from that. Obviously, operational, right? If we're relying upon X group to create widgets for us, that could potentially lead to some type of operational disruption, depending upon how, you know, their disruptions and how things kind of flow. From a compliance perspective, there's a huge amount of work that's being done now in relation to something called Bill S-211, which has to do with labor and human rights and slavery within your supply chain, right? So are we complying to those regulations? That also ties to the legal piece, obviously. The financial implications, there's gonna be a really interesting example that Deepak is gonna talk about in a second, but you know, it follows from the first two, the financial implications that can come from any issues that we have during the relationship. Obviously, from a people perspective, what does that mean for those that we have and those we're potentially outsourcing to when it comes from the people perspective? And then reputation. And reputation is one of those interesting nebulous pieces that, you know, it can be a result of a whole bunch of other implications, but maybe we're not even experiencing any of these other pieces, but because X person is in the news and we are associated with X person, we then get painted with that same brush, right? So it creates this little interesting web of all these fun things that have expanded our risk exposures.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I think one example that is actually quite interesting is Kanye West's relationship with Adidas. So again, when we look at third-party risk management, most individuals will think kind of broader organizations, or generally they'll look to think someone hacked or obtained information. That's not necessarily just the risk that's posed by a third party. Here, Kanye West made some anti-Semitic marks, and unfortunately the reputational damage that was done was very significant to Adidas. But the financial implications were huge as well. The deal that was currently in place was over $1.5 billion, and it left Adidas with over $1 billion worth of stock with the Kanye West brand. So what were they to do with that and how they got rid of that? Oh, sorry, it just got loud all of a sudden. Was very interesting. So something that's very important to know, and the reason we wanted to expand the definition of third-party risk is it's not just an organization. We have sole proprietors, we have individuals, celebrities, it could be marketing affiliates. The list is endless, right? And I appreciate that it's very hard to get maybe a grasp on all of these, but that brings in the idea of risk and criticality to an organization, which we'll kind of touch on in a little while, but I'll let Phil explain the Blackboard example.
Yeah, so there's a couple of other examples that we wanted to go through. So Blackbaud is an organization that a number of entities use for donors or advancement, right? So there was a ton of post-secondaries in Canada and the US that utilized Blackbaud in order to send out those things and say, hey, you did a master's here, give me money. What ended up happening is Blackbaud experienced a cyber breach. It impacted about 13,000 of their corporate clients and the individuals that they were holding that information for, confidential and private information. Now, I remember receiving notification of this breach. I didn't really care who Blackbaud was. I cared that my university was sending me notification of this breach, right? The third party's risks became my university's risk. And I don't have enough care to go into the nuance to figure that out. At the end of the day, the impact, the implication was to the person that I had the relationship with as a client, which was my university. And they obtained, from my eyes, the reputational damage.
Fantastic. And then just quickly moving on to Uber as another example here. Again, something to highlight here is this breach actually occurred because of someone obtaining information just from one contractor. That's all they needed. And even though multi-factor authentication was in place, this hacker continued to use the contractor's credentials until eventually they were allowed in. This allowed them access to Teams, to Slack, and a number of other important pieces of information. But again, it's not a sophisticated cyber network that did this. It was a single individual hacker who obtained information, again, because risk management practices were not in place. But to Phil's point, I don't look at the third party. I'll look at Uber. And what that makes me think about is, do I want to use Uber? Can I trust Uber? And those reputational damages can be very, very pervasive and last a long time. It only takes one individual to spread the word to someone else, and this leads to a lot of issues. And again, reputational, legal, there's a number of things we can consider here. So at the end of the day, what we really need to get an understanding of, and hopefully this is coming across, is the traditional concept of what a vendor is pretty much dead. We need to really expand this and consider what a third party is and just how broad it can be.
Yeah, one other example that we wanted to highlight, and we specifically wanted to bring this one, is an organization called Celero. What they do is they provide systems for a number of organizations, but they're quite a critical vendor for a number of smaller financial institutions in Canada. The credit union network relies upon them for a bunch of different things. So Celero experienced a cyber incident which then had implications for their clients. The reason that we wanted to bring this one up is everything we've kind of been talking about has kind of been singularly focused on an entity or an individual. This, a breach, as we noted with something like Celero, kind of has system implications, right? The broader credit union system, there were a lot of articles written about their situation, their reliance, right? It wasn't singularly any one credit union that was impacted. It was a whole system. So when we think about system reliance and concentration of third parties that a system relies upon, right, a whole industry and a whole sector was implicated from, a single incident because there was that concentration and that reliance upon a single entity. Toyota.
Oh yeah, I could do it here, sure. Yeah. So this kind of highlights again on the production issues. There was a small disruption to a supplier based on a cyber attack. This goes and leads on to kind of, as I said, the supply chain went so deep. Eventually, when we got towards the end of that supply chain, they were unable to provide or obtain certain parts. And this small organization had such a large ramification for a large brand like Toyota. And this really highlighted the need to have an understanding of what your supply chain looks like. There isn't a lot we can do in terms of maybe preventing a number of organizations using third parties. At the end of the day, we all use them. But what we can do is implement prudent practices that must be followed within our contractual agreements to minimize our risk exposures and kind of ensure that who our third parties work with is in line with what our expectations are.
So Deepak was giving me a nice little transition there because we now want to talk about, so we've talked about third parties, what is third party risk, giving you some examples there. We now wanted to move into what is this broader piece that we see with regards to this concept of third party risk management. So when we step back and we take a look at it, a definition that is generally used is up on the screen there. So it's all the things that we do to understand and appreciate the threats that stem from the use of third parties. Again, that very broad definition of what third parties are. So when we think about, then again, setting up third-party risk management, any programmatic approach that we want to have to there, it's the processes that an organization, the processes, the controls that an organization has in place to manage the entities, the third parties, across what we end up calling the third-party life cycle, okay? And what the life cycle is this is how we conceptualize it, right? So there's a bunch of different ways to look at it. Deepak and I, over a couple of drinks and a whiteboard, came up with this to highlight what this thing is. So I'll walk through it very quickly, and then Deepak is going to go through the main items as we highlight it. But what we really wanted to try to conceptualize here is, at the end of the day, if we have to contract or get into agreements with third parties because it helps us do what we need to do, right? If we do everything in-house, we're never going to get to where we need to be. So what we tried to do is thinking cradle to grave, right? How can we think about the different component parts that we have to ensure that we go through in order to manage that said relationship? So we want to make sure that we're going through the appropriate processes to identify and perform due diligence upon those third parties. We want to make sure that after that is done, we appropriately contract and onboard, right? Deepak is a lawyer. I can tell you he's going to drone on and on about this piece, but it is actually very important. We want to make sure we're monitoring the performance there and then evaluating how that organization has done or how that entity has done as we go through. And then we get to a point of potential off-board or renewal with that organization. And then hopefully the cycle might kick forward again. So again, these 5 steps tries to help to conceptualize, cradle to grave, how we engage with third parties.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And I'm not just going to say the contracting and onboarding, but I do think that the first 2 phases are the most important because they fundamentally set you up for success or failure. So the first piece is identification and due diligence. And what this really looks to do is we need to understand who are we engaging with, who is this third party. So what we really want to do is first define what we need the third party for. Internally across organizations, this is usually done through their business case that's developed, but really we want to get an understanding of who are the people, what are the processes we need them for, what's the technology they'll be touching, what type of data will they be looking at. And really we have 2 different components here. We have risk and we have criticality. When we look at a risk lens, we want to look at the actual organization, i.e. what's their financial stability, is there any litigation pending on this organization, what's their reputation, do they consider key practices, maybe we're very focused on ESG or other areas, how will this impact us by working with this entity? Then we want to look at what we have the concept of actual criticality, and what that means is from our organization's perspective, given the service that they're providing, how important are they? And there are a number of different considerations we want to look at when we consider criticality. And what this is around organizational structure. So again, forming as a part of the risk assessment, are we working with an individual entity, a partnership, a limited liability organization? Each has legal ramifications in terms of recourse and what we can do. Data, what is the type and what is the access? Is it sensitive? Is it private? Who's going to hold data in transit? Where will it be stored? These are all important considerations and again can have ramifications. As Phil highlighted, concentration, so availability of alternates. Do we have alternate service providers that we can leverage and diversify our risk? If not, again, we may want to consider the monitoring of this vendor more important. Risk management practices, can we get an understanding of what practices they have? Has there been a history or an understanding of any issues that have arisen with this third party when they've supported other organizations? Size of contractual expenditure is always an important one, particularly within the public sector. But is this $100,000 or, in fact, what we actually often see in a number of contracts, it could be $25,000 over 5 years and renewed every year. The actual total sum does add up, so we do need to be careful on what we consider there. And then finally, jurisdiction. Again, are they providing services from Canada, the US, from the European Union? We have implications such as GDPR and other things as well. Should something go wrong, what country's actual legal system will take prevalence? All important considerations when we look to understand this. What this normally surmises is in the development of what we call a kind of criticality and or materiality assessment. And what we like to have there is some key questions that are uniform, and then these are going to be actually performed by either a business unit head and signed off by an appropriate member of risk management. But what we'll actually look to do is quantify the scores, because what we want to do is take a standardized approach in terms of how we manage risk. Now, I think one important thing is to note that we appreciate in certain instances you won't have the availability to have an alternate. You generally need to go with someone that you have. So what does that mean? There's always got to be a qualitative component that is included inside of these forms, because common sense has to prevail. We can sit here and say you should go back to your vendors and ask for X, Y, Z, but I promise you if you call Microsoft, they're not going to care. So at the end of the day, what can we do and how we work around that is going to be very important. So contracting and onboarding, I'm not going to lie to you, as Phil said, my favorite part, but probably the most important part, because this is the document that establishes your entire relationship. If something goes wrong, you go back to this document. So again, having an understanding of this is very important. This is where we establish our service standards, have our SLAs, our KPIs, understanding those rules of limitations. So what we can do is, while we may not want to prevent a third party from subcontracting our work, we may want to have an acknowledgement and acceptance clause. So you know every time that third party is actually going outside to get support for the services that you've contracted them for. Putting in an offboarding process is essential. Most times organizations go out and they hire a third party, and this third party performs its services, contracts up for renewal, you decide not to do it, and then there's a lapse. There's no knowledge transition. There's no one coming in. Can we have something in there to protect yourselves to make sure that this transition is very smooth and the appropriate provisions are in there? This could be destruction of data. This could be how they disseminate data that you've provided them. This could be their removal or revocation of access to systems. All of this needs to be inside your contract to provide you with that safety net. And then performance monitoring. You'd be very surprised actually around this. So it's very interesting. We help a number of organizations, large and small, across the government, private, public sectors. And we always note that organizations come to us and tell us, oh, there's been a major issue. Can you help us? And what we try to understand is, okay, is this something that happened just off the cuff, or is this something that actually had a journey towards it? And more often than not, there was a journey towards it. However, there was poor performance monitoring because until an issue arose, no one actually bothered to have a dedicated individual looking at service level reports, understanding the relationship, understanding KPIs and SLAs. Because at the end of the day, if things were working fine, that meant everything was going great. But that's not always the case. So where we can take preventative measures to make sure we're monitoring our third parties is very important. A way of actually doing this is obtaining things like SOC 2 reports, giving us an understanding of technology controls. We could understand their BCP plans. We could get the disaster recovery reports or tests. There's a number of things that give us an understanding of how this entity is performing and how this entity is going to go forward and help us with the services that we've hired them for. And I think the other thing is just providing some form of management oversight, so i.e. providing some form of risk reporting just to understand what's going on to those in charge. A lot of times we have a number of different organizations, some of them very large, that don't actually have forms of risk reporting. So members within the organization are not actually aware of some of the issues that are ongoing. And then when an event occurs, again, it kind of comes as a surprise. But if there had been reporting and effective monitoring, we may have been able to prevent an issue with a third party. And then moving on to evaluation. So with the term completed or pending renewal, we want to determine the effectiveness of the relationship. So again, grading the overall relationship, making sure that we have a value realization. This is the one time that you have an opportunity often to make changes to your contract. This could be to reflect changes in legislation, in regulatory requirements, or generally the service that's being provided, and obviously a great opportunity to negotiate costs. And then finally, offboarding or service renewal, ensuring the continuity of our outcomes. So again, the execution of that renewal plan or transition plan then had been established, updating our contract finally, whether this is the renewal or execution. And then again, generally having an updated third-party database is quite important. And the reason I'll highlight this is, and I can honestly say this, I've seen this across several organizations where there are multiple different departments within an organization using a third party, but there are departments within that same organization who have legal proceedings against the said third party, and no one's aware. And so when we come in and we have this conversation, literally we have department heads who are like, oh, I did not know that. So there's no form of communication or understanding, which again leads to having some form of system where we can blacklist an entity and or where we have that reporting, as I had alluded to earlier, just to kind of give that understanding and I guess institutional knowledge to those within the organization.
So we wanted to, our first two objectives were to kind of define it, third-party risk, and then also talk about third-party risk management and what some of these elements are. We've kind of buried the lead a little bit as we were kind of talking, and we've had the opportunity to go through this with a number of organizations and see where there has been strengths and where there has been weaknesses. Due to the expanding requirements, due to the definitions being changed and whatnot, quite frankly, not a lot of organizations have a great handle on managing their third parties and by extension, the parties that follow on from that, right? The third parties that their third parties contract with. So what we wanted to highlight is that we feel there is a little bit of a need for a different approach. And again, if we step back and take a look at it, there's a few potential root causes when we do a little bit of an examination on that. Sometimes we see organizations have a fairly narrow definition of what a third party is. Deepak was talking about OSFI now expanding that definition. It used to just be, taking one example, it used to just be vendors or individuals that you're outsourcing to. Now we're talking partners, sponsorships, right? Any third party that you are working with, right? Doesn't have to necessarily just be the provision of goods and services. And I think the Kanye West example really kind of makes that one real there, right? It was a sponsorship that they essentially had, a marketing affiliation that they had, and it resulted in huge reputational damage as well as knock-on effects. There's not a lot of clear governance when it comes to the management of third parties. And this is where I think that we're going to start trying to make this a little bit more real for the business continuity professionals in this room, because what role do we play? How do we plug into that broader integrated approach that hopefully organizations are taking when it comes to managing third parties throughout that life cycle? Where do we fit in? How do we make sure that we're part of those conversations? Because we're only going to be one point, but we have to think about things holistically and how we can contribute overall to how the organization is doing so. And then following on from that, those disconnected and unaligned processes, right? And if we don't have those things, how do we have effective information, data, reporting to inform our decisions? So again, our thesis, our thing that we try to keep for anybody that's willing to listen to us, we keep going forward to say that at the end of the day, we want to make sure that there is some type of holistic, integrated approach when it comes to managing third parties. So again, when we think about it, we need to have diversity of perspective and integration of some of these processes, right? And this is just illustrative, there's a ton of different examples to this, but we have to think about when we're managing third parties. What are the compliance implications? How is information being managed? What about our people, right? When we think about ESG or any social responsibility aspects to things, the financial implications, operational resilience, all these different elements have to be considered throughout. The only way we can do that is by having a diversity of perspectives and having the right people at the table throughout the process to make sure there's a continuous process as we manage across that life cycle. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and pontificate anymore. I think on the last two slides I did that quite a bit. We have to be realistic and think about it from a practical perspective, right? Every organization has a different approach to risk management based upon our size, our structure, our resource availability, all those different types of things. The form and function about how we go about managing risk varies across organizations. My little illustration on the side there, right? There are tons of organizations that have a true consolidated corporate view of things, right? But others have maybe more of a federated model where there might be a central body that helps to manage risk and all these different areas do things, or maybe we're much more further on the spectrum where it's left to individual business units to manage their own risk with very little support, right? Everybody's kind of enabled to make their own decisions. There's benefits and drawbacks wherever you sit upon that spectrum, right, to allow for certain nimbleness or certain more centralized control. But at the end of the day, regardless of the choice that we have made for how we want to manage risk, the form and the function can be organizational specific, but we have to have some consistency with how we drive and go forward with things. And this is where I would hope that, as continuity professionals, we're all kind of thinking about that. How do we fit within the broader structures that our organization has to help manage these exposures that we have from third parties? So when we have the opportunity to go in and take a look at any type of risk management program, but specifically if we're thinking about third-party risk management, this is, again, Deepak and I over a drink and a whiteboard. We tried to categorize it in this way, right? So there's 9 elements that we typically look at, as well as that fall into 3 subcategories. And for anybody that's audited, right, you're used to the concept of design effectiveness and then operational effectiveness. We added essentially a third piece in there that's kind of outcomes, looking at what the outputs or the outcomes of a program might be. But essentially, if we think about the design, what is the governance and strategy that the organization has overall when it comes to third-party risk management? And then the fine print under there is, how does business continuity fit into that, right? The policy, the frameworks, and the tools. What is that setup? How do we essentially have the things in place to make sure that we're driving to potentially, later on, some of those consistent outcomes? Another key kicker is risk appetite, right? When we go through and we think about what these potential impacts might be, are we considering the amount of risk that the organization is willing to take in the pursuit of its value, right? How does that factor in? Because that might dictate whether or not that business case that Deepak was alluding to actually fits and makes sense. Getting into the operationalization piece, when we think about our processes, how across that life cycle that we put it, that others have put it, how are we making sure that we're managing risk throughout there, that there's the right processes in place? Do we have the right people and skill sets in order to execute on those things? Thinking about all those different elements from a compliance perspective, a data perspective, a continuity of operations perspectives. And then how are we monitoring, reporting, communicating about results or where we're essentially sitting? And then outcomes. And outcomes can be fun and nebulous and tough to kind of latch onto, right? But there's a lot of regulators that are now thinking about like risk culture, right? So what's the culture of the organization? How do we think about risk? How do we appreciate risk? And by extension, the work that we're doing with our third parties. How is information utilized in order to inform our decision making? And then what are we doing to monitor the progress of our processes, right? And hopefully have continuous improvement. So this is a little bit of a framework that we use in order to kind of do so and think about third-party risk management. So wanted to share that and give you some of our high-level thoughts there. So as I kind of mentioned when I was doing my introduction, I kind of came into this game from the business continuity lens, right? And that's how my brain always kind of reverts and kind of thinks. So the cool thing when, third-party risks started becoming a little bit of a thing that Deepak and I were thinking about is I was kind of coming into this anyway, because I remember doing a ton of business impact analyses and going through all that fun things. And we always think and talk about, the supply or, the knock-on effects, reliance upon third party for XYZ process, interdependencies, interlinkages, all that fun things. It was always kind of something that we thought about from an operational disruptive perspective. So I think that there is already, as a profession, we're already kind of primed from that perspective. But again, if there's this drive from a regulatory perspective, from an organizational perspective, from sectors and industries to get a better handle on third-party risk management, I think we have to make sure that we're thinking about how can we appropriately plug in across that life cycle so that we are doing the right things by our organizations, that we're thinking, contributing to the overall approach that the organization has from managing its third parties, right? So how can we make sure we're kind of fitting in there and making it all come together? So this is our life cycle, right? And what I wanted to leave off with, and this is the point where I'm going to share with you some of the spots that I think business continuity can fit in across the life cycle, and business continuity professionals can contribute to the third-party risk management life cycle. But I'd love to hear from the group if I'm either covering anything, if you vehemently and violently disagree with anything that I'm highlighting, but this is what I wanted to share. So Deepak gave us a great definition when it came to the identification and the due diligence part of contracting with a third party. So what I would think that from a continuity professional, we would want to think about, what is the criticality of that vendor, right? If that vendor is not available, what disruption could that potentially lead to our systems, to our peoples, to our processes, right? What due diligence are we performing upon that vendor in order to make sure they have the right risk management processes in places, that they have disaster recovery, that they have an appropriate cybersecurity response mechanisms, that they have business continuity plans, and that they test them and they practice them, all that fun stuff, from an identification and due diligence perspective. Oh, sorry. Sorry. I'll go a little slower. So we want to make sure that we're doing that due diligence, asking those questions about the planning that they have in place, the testing that they do, all those good things, right? And something that I'll point everybody towards, there's a good organization called Shared Assessments, so shared assessments, and their business is coming up with vendor questionnaires that they send out. And there's like 800 questions. I'm not saying you need all 800 questions, but there's some good stuff in there that can get into some interesting specifics about some of that due diligence.
There is a light version with about 100 as well, so you might want to use that instead.
800, 100, who knows, right? It depends on how many questions you want to ask.
If you're going to get through those 800 as quick as Philip's speaking, you'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the rest of us, you probably want the 100.
Okay, enough from can you turn off his mic? Okay, there we go. So, see, and he's getting in the way of me talking about his favorite part, which is contracting and onboarding. So now, if we've done this appropriate due diligence, and as Deepak alluded to, if we don't have an effective contract or agreement in place, how are we going to be able to manage that third party going forward? So all of these good things that we want to understand, right? Gathering maybe an annual SOC report from an organization, or gaining an attestation from their leadership with regards to continuity tests that might have taken place, the results of those tests. Can we make sure that things like that are included within our contracts? Can we make sure that we have maybe within there a right to audit, right? And part of that audit might be the efficacy or the existence of continuity plans, right? So how can we make sure that whatever we want to see in order to manage that third party throughout the life cycle, that we include it within those contracts? And again, to Deepak's point, if we're dealing with Microsoft, you're probably agreeing to the contract on their paper, but maybe if we're not, we might be agreeing it to our terms and conditions. So how can we bake things in there?
Sorry, I was just going to add, one of the important things there is that, getting a SOC 2 report actually costs quite a lot of money because it's actually done through an independent third party. So a lot of organizations come to us and say, well, this is great, we're going to ask the vendor or third party. They'll generally say no because it is quite costly. So having these negotiations up front and putting this in the contract up front basically lets all parties know what those levels of expectations are. Otherwise, generally, you will probably have to wait until the service renewal period to renegotiate.
Yeah, which again, He's the lawyer, but he is right. Having stuff in the contract is key. Then we get to the performance monitoring and then the evaluation piece. And I want to tackle those together because they are really about, at the end of the day, how is the third party doing, right? So, and again, this goes back to the contracting piece. Maybe we include within the terms of the contract that they need to provide us reporting on a certain frequency with regards to, you know, anything that they're particularly doing, hitting on KPIs, all that type of stuff. Further to that, maybe we're including things about notification, about disruption incidents, not just from a cyber perspective, but from other lenses, right? To make sure that we have good information and we can monitor how they're doing with regards to their overall risk environment or anything like that, right? The concept of near misses, maybe we have to include something around those lenses. And then when we come to evaluation, right, so performance monitoring is a little bit of the ongoing. Evaluation is towards the end of that agreement. How do we think about how they've done in totality, where our organization is sitting, where their organization is sitting, and, you know, does it make forward? Can we put forward an opinion or give some thoughts about how that third party is done and whether or not we should offboard them, get rid of them, or renew, right? And the offboarding and the renewal one, and I hate to kind of say it, but it always goes back to that contracting piece. Have we ensured that we have the right processes in place to transition away from that vendor if it does come to a certain situation, right? So how can we make sure that data is appropriately understood, that there's the unwinding of processes, that IP is appropriately managed, all those fun little things. And, you know, IP might not be top for business from a business continuity lens, but it can lead to hiccups and disruption and all that those fun things that cause us issues, right? So when we get to that piece, it is going to be reliant upon what we got in the contract, but how can we make sure that they're considered when we go from an offboarding perspective? So I did go over that really fast, and I apologize, but this is the one where I first wanted to kind of pause here. This was my perspectives. You know, Deepak and I drove from Toronto, so we had 4 hours to kind of listen to me drone on about this stuff. These are some of the things that I think about because I don't have another hobby, right? But I'd love to hear from your perspective. You know, we captured our 5 stages, and I've shared for you some of the things where I see we can potentially fit in. Is that making sense to people? Is it resonating? Are there things that potentially I haven't thought about or missed, or I'm completely off base with?
Hi, my name is Greg.
Hi.
Could you go back to slide 24, please?
I don't know which one slide 24 is, but you tell me when to stop.
So this one here.
Yeah.
I'm really happy to see that you identified culture,
Yes.
but I don't think you're underscoring the importance of it as an outcome because
Okay.
it's there. It's like the oxygen of an organization, and we'll eat strategy for breakfast every day.
Peter Drucker?
So part of that, yes, thank you. I'll take that for you. But when it comes to anything to do with if you're coming into an organization,
Yeah.
looking at third parties or even that day-to-day operations, what's the culture in terms of risk?
Yes.
And it's not just at the outcome stage, it's throughout everything.
Yes.
And it leads to, like, for culture and decision-making, how do you plug your lessons learned and identify
Absolutely.
along the way as part of that? So it needs
Yeah.
to be considered in there.
So-
Again, it's an outcome,
Yes.
but it's also a primogenitor that has to be looked at in terms of design as well.
Absolutely.
And how you can then inform it and then move it along the chain to where you want it to be.
Yeah, I love that. So firstly, that's like my favorite Drucker quote, by the way, so I appreciate you bringing that one up. But it is kind of that interesting piece. See, from my perspective, when we were putting this together, and I always love this because crowdsourcing thought, now Deepak and I have another thing to talk about on our 4-hour drive back to Toronto. But I was thinking about culture from an internal perspective, but thinking about the culture of our third party, right? Are they a reactive, like if we think even from a compliance perspective, are you reactive to compliance measures or are you trying to be proactive and sharing that information with your clients, that type of thing? So I was kind of thinking about it more insularly from the first party, but I like where you're going with thinking about it even from a third party lens. So thank you, that's a good takeaway.
You have 2 bubbles of culture.
Yeah.
You bring in a consultant or a third party to bring a service or a good or
Yeah.
even a thought process on how they approach something.
Yeah,
So you're talking 2 bubbles, and you can find a big bubble will get absorbed by a small bubble, will
Yeah.
get absorbed by a big one. But the issue is that it's the right, that's the area that you have to try to influence, because you can make all the different positional things and all the recommendations you want, but if it doesn't meet the culture, and of course all the other aspects, but the culture specifically in the thought process, it's gonna go dead in the water.
Yeah.
Which is where access to the C-suite, your business continuity management, being part of the C-suite at the same level or within that risk management identification, that structure, and speak directly truth to power.
Yep.
Is hugely important to
Yeah, I like it. Any other thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
Just to add to what you've been saying, looking at, and it's 2 slides further. It's
Oh, hold on.
Your BCM, TPRM.
This one?
Yes.
Yes.
So that's all great. I see that working. I see from a third-party perspective, you know, we're all kind of coming at this from the same objective manner, but the culture piece,
Mm.
you're dealing with an organization that is rather, you use the word nebulous,
Mhm.
so that risk is, it's always a little hard to handle, to
Mhm.
manage, and I would say that the challenge is with the first party.
Mhm.
It's how to manage that, you know, and again, with what Deepak was saying, you know, to what, that initial identification, setting that governance piece, and then with contracting and onboarding and having all of those elements clearly identified, that only goes so far.
Mhm.
You know, so you need to have this conversation. It always gets back to communication and clarity and
Mhm.
intent and expectations, and have that going.
Absolutely.
throughout the process.
And-
really working with the first party.
Absolutely, and from that perspective too, the only way we can do this, and this goes to that diversity of perspectives and all that kind of stuff, think about the number of groups that in a fairly, even in a mid-sized organization, need to be involved through this if our thesis is kind of correct, right? We got our risk group, we got our legal group, we got our compliance group, like all those different parties, all those different groups need to be involved throughout this cycle, right? And that's hard, getting a bunch of different parts of the organization, even talking about it and coming through it from a consistent lens. So I think your point resonates really well. How do we make sure that there is some type of general understanding about all the dogs pulling the sled in the same direction, right? It's tough.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like responsibility and accountability does lie with obviously the first party. It's interesting because I'm supporting actually a wealth management organization right now, and they're developing a materiality assessment. And it's very interesting because, to be very objective, it's useless. But what they're doing is we want to introduce the concept. It's not about getting it right. It's just we know our stakeholders won't do it. We're going to take a long-phased approach. But to your point, that comes back down to that culture setting, that accountability, driving it from the top. But there's actually a lot of issues within the organization itself. So we can come here and preach all we like. But to your point, it really is around setting that tone, that culture. It has to drive itself all the way down. And again, it needs to be echoed and followed as well. And I think to your point, this is all fantastic, but it really does all start and end with the first party. So that's a great point.
Any other thoughts? Yes.
Question for you.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard the keynote this morning, with Dr. Homer Dixon. He presented something, and his justification was a light bulb moment for me, where he's mentioned that crisis is a calculation of stresses times triggers. Would you relate that back to what you do?
So I wasn't in the keynote this morning. We were practicing this, so can you go over that again? So you're saying crisis is the result of triggers,
Crisis are,
stressors.
yes, stressors times triggers.
Okay.
So your stressors are always there. There's nothing we can do about them. Triggers, we can't predict them. And when it happens, that's what creates a crisis.
Sure.
Over the years, I've thought to myself many times, you know, especially when I'm dealing with the RM folks, that we overcomplicate our risk management. That, you know, we get so caught up in a process that we stop thinking about, you know, what our outcome should be.
Yep.
And so, as I said, that's a light bulb moment for me. And I just want to get your opinion. Like, do you think that we've overcomplicated the risk management process?
So a couple avenues on that one. Part of the work that I also do is on the ERM perspective. Yeah, we've probably overcomplicated a few things there. The reason that I actually get attracted and resonating quite well with the third-party risk management piece is there's some practical outcomes from this one, right? Like we have a list of entities that we are engaging with, and we have to actually put in controls, maybe through a contract or through other things, that lead to like practical outcomes. Like there's going to be a contract or an agreement in place that has terms that can actually help to manage some of these exposures. So broadly speaking, I have to think about that definition that you kind of had there, the stressors versus the triggers, but I mean, it kind of all makes sense, right? You have your pressure points and then something that's going to cause the thing to go. But to your other question, have we overcomplicated things? Probably writ large, yes. I kind of like this one because it makes it a little bit more practical from my perspective.
So I think, the reason for, well, my favorite quote is common sense is not common, which is very true. So that's generally why there's a lot of processes around things. But I agree with you, stresses will always be there. I think the advantages of having some of these processes, though, is that when those triggers are actually pulled, we have the mechanism to actually react very quickly and be aware. And I think awareness is the key thing, because if there is a trigger and we're not aware of it, the further that goes along, the deeper the ramifications. So having processes going through the life cycle, managing all that through the identification due diligence, it allows us to set a foundation to be able to react to those triggers a lot quicker versus having to retrospectively react, and that can lead to a lot of problems. I think that's the way we would probably look at that quote and then factor it in here, is this helps you lay the groundwork to react to those triggers quicker.
Well, his theory was is that we spend too much time looking at the triggers.
Yep.
Yeah, and we have no control over it. So why are we wasting our time with that when we should focus more on the stresses?
Yeah.
How we can alleviate the stresses that cause the crisis.
I think some things you would do, I do agree. Like if you have the foundations and the appropriate processes in place, let's just say there was some monitoring tools, as an example with Adidas for Kanye West, they picked this up in the newspapers or tabloids, that would give them awareness, right? How they reacted to that is different. What we're not saying is, and I think what he may have been alluding to in the speech, my apologies, I wasn't there, is that we don't want to dedicate resource just monitoring Kanye West. That is an absolute waste of time. But I think if we line those processes up, it gives us that opportunity to have that awareness. And that's really what this comes down to, is just awareness. So again, depending on the complexity size of the organization, you could have thousands of vendors, you could have 20 vendors, right? Depending on the approach, a centralized vendor management office or kind of, a different type of model. Again, it really is just about laying those foundations to best sort the risk appetite of the organization out. But I think that's a fantastic point. And I think it's not just third-party risk management, ERM, there's a number of processes we could even go to internal audit. Everything is overcomplicated right now, and I think we are a quite pessimistic society and looking at that from that lens. But again, I think if we have the foundations in place, that awareness and those triggers just allows us to have a process to react.
Yes. Oh, sorry, and then I think your hand was up too? Yeah, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Just again, thinking about the work I've done with many clients, when we're doing these third-party things, of course, they'll bring up the Microsoft and say, well, there's nothing we can do about that.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious, because then then you start looking at other vendors. So do you even see in your practice where you'll start to group some of these third parties?
Mhm.
Because these ones where I'm not going to be able to do nothing with Microsoft, but
Yep.
I want you to concentrate maybe on a sole source or a
Yeah.
supplier that maybe you have a good relationship, because everybody,
Yeah,
what I mean? Like,
100%.
see that in
So,
your first part of your stage when you are looking at this?
yeah, and it kind of depends. So we have seen it from a fairly sophisticated organization goes through that we observed. They kind of go through like what they call a third party or a vendor stratification. So they have they kind of say how critical are they versus expenditure. They had this weird model to kind of put it, but they bucketed them to that point, right? They're either a tier 1 supplier or so on and so forth. One of the things that they did have as a factor into that little calculation that they went into is how much influence do we have over these guys, right? And this organization I'm alluding to, huge, but they're not going to dictate, to Microsoft or to any of the big boys what they're going to do, right? So it's all about, so to your point, yes, stratifying and then using that materiality or that criticality assessment, because maybe we don't want to, we only have, there's a finite amount of resources and an infinite amount of things we want to do with them. So where's the biggest bang for our buck to make sure that we're managing the exposure throughout, right? So yeah, stratification is a regular thing. And it goes back to that criticality or that materiality assessment.
Just one more question.
Sure.
Do you guys, in your contracts, do you actually start putting in penalties?
Yeah, so, I mean, to be honest with you, I've worked with a lot of organizations across the board, and yeah, it is there. A lot of them will have different, recourses. So whether that's a direct financial penalty, whether that will be a discount, whether it will go to mediation, arbitration, so on. But with a robust contract where there is a likelihood of this to happen, I think it is important to have a form of recourse, because silence generally reflects the party that obviously it's not going to help the party that needs it at that point in time. So I think having something robust there is important. Standardized T's and C's, we always generally say if we're using your organization's terms and conditions, they'll have already gone through your legal department review. not really much of an issue. When you deviate away from these, or when you actually have your third party's terms and conditions, that's when you probably want to involve your legal party, just to make sure that they're kind of aware. And then it really is a process, right? Again, you could have HR involved, you could have procurement involved, supply chain involved. There's a number of different areas. But I do think it's important for those robust contracts to have something listed there, because we've seen this, and it can lead to a lot of issues, right? Particularly if it goes through litigation and there's silent clauses, it can add up to a lot of money. So often, actually, the money you spend to go through litigation is more than you would have got from the penalty in itself. So that's why a lot of organizations don't even go down that route. And then, obviously, it's a retrospective component. One great example, actually, a delegated administrative authority called me day before yesterday, and they actually asked me, it was very funny, they go to me, we have a third party and they're using a fourth party. We're not happy with this fourth party. What can we do? And I said, well, what does your contract say? So they put the phone down. They called me back half an hour later and they said, it says nothing. And I said, well, then you can do nothing. You can call the party and say, we don't like this. Can you please not use them? But you haven't set any parameters in terms of what they can do. So again, a lot of organizations are just going through because, again, until there's an issue, no one wants to react. But what we're not saying is go back and kind of, tell your legal department to rewrite everything, but in certain instances, it is going to be important to put these clauses in. And then that goes back to the tiering piece as well, right? Like where you may want to have a right to audit, where you may want to have a SOC 2 report, where you may want these things. So again, once we kind of have that tiering and we understand what that risk and criticality is, we can go from there.
Yeah. So, yeah, your question, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When it comes to confidential things, will you have to agree to a contract to be able to access it, or even beforehand during the due diligence, you can get access to that?
So I think a lot of these documentations, for the larger organizations are going to be publicly available, but where you are dealing with sensitive information, you could easily sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, where you get this information. Most organizations, as a third party, will want your business, so it's kind of their incentive to provide you with the information that you need. Again, what you do with that is important, so having that NDA, having a discussion with them, I think there are some ways around it, but the way I always look at it is if the contracting party does want to work with you, you are paying them for that service, right? So it's in their incentive to give you the information that you need. Where you need to be careful is not going overboard. So again, just getting enough. And if you do contract with them, depending on that contractual expenditure, you can kind of make sense of what makes sense to ask from them as well. If you have a $50,000 contract, don't ask them for a SOC report because it probably costs them more than that. But working that out and working alongside them, I think signing the NDA makes perfect sense. But initially upfront, some organizations will be a bit reluctant because they don't want to just hand out key information. But if you do have an NDA and it is a broader process, we see this with public sector RFPs all the time, it is in your incentive to provide that.
And your second question?
The second one was about, how we're talking about the fact that it's the gaps actually, and when we're talking about the contracting, a lot of this is a lot of legal,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's how is sometimes in the organization, the legal side, the compliance side, the risk management are
Yeah.
all different entities. So how do you in your experience, you make it work for the information to be able to
Yeah.
flow between all of those people to communicate together and to kind of work together with the research parties?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's going to be a really long answer.
Yeah.
But I think it goes back to there's a cultural element to it and there's a framework element to it, right? So it's not going to be an overnight kind of switch. It's about figuring out how we can influence and how different elements of risk can influence and come to a consistent approach to that, right? And it goes a lot to how the organization is set up and all of those things. I think we got to.
So I can answer that question for you after, because
Yeah,
that's a
we'll
very
chat
good
after.
question.
Okay, well, thank you. That's all the time we have for. The next session will start right at 11 o'clock, so you have a couple minutes to get to the next place you're going. But please join me in thanking Philip and Deepak.
Thank you. Sorry, we went a little long there.